Got it.
Sorry, I hit the recording. So can you start that over, Dean? Sorry.
That's okay. Chief Initiative Officer of the Center for Housing Opportunity and Director of Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity, to talk about affordable housing, some of the issues that we were just surfacing in our conversation here, and hopefully completely packed with solutions that'll weave themselves through our consciousness, and we'll be able to push forward going forward. I'm a little doubtful about that. And then Pete Harrison, Executive Director of Desegregate Connecticut, is going to follow on with a conversation about that. So it should be pretty interesting, pretty politically interesting and provocative, we hope. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christy to introduce yourself a little bit more and then start your presentation. And then you will hand it off to Pete. And just a housekeeping for everybody. Please mute yourselves. I can do that if I have to, but it's better if you do it. And then if you have questions, Christy and Peter both said, look, if you have a question while they're presenting, raise your hand in the participants list. And if you go over and down in the bottom, there's a section called reactions, and just raise your hand. With that, I'll see it and recognize you to ask your question. And you can also put things in the chat if you want. I'll be tracking the chat. So with that, Christy, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. First of all, it's lovely. And I see some familiar faces, which is always nice. I thought I would start. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself and my organization, and then I'm going to give you kind of a 30,000 foot view of some data as context for the recommendations, the policy and practice recommendations that the Center for Housing Opportunity is pushing forward. But as Dean said, please interrupt. I can't see you, but he can, so please interrupt me. I don't want to talk at you this morning. I'm happy to make this as interactive as you like. So again, my name is Christy Stewart. I am the Chief Initiative Officer for the Centers for Housing Opportunity at an organization called the Housing Collective. The Housing Collective has been around with different names since about 2006. Some of you may know it as Supportive Housing Works. I work for David Rich, who some of you may know, but we are the backbone organization working to end homelessness and ensure stable and affordable housing throughout Connecticut. And we adhere to a collective impact framework, which loosely just means we collaborate and leverage strategic partners around a common agenda, shared metrics and data, ongoing communication, reinforcing activities, and dedicated staff. And my role there is to oversee the Centers for Housing Opportunity.
It turns out Alicia and Bill have asked me to join a meeting.
So I oversee the Center for Housing Opportunity.
I did that for you, Christy. I'm not sure. So I'll announce it if that comes in again.
No worries. And currently we have a Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. In January, we launched a Litchfield County Center for Housing Opportunity, and we're looking at potentially an Eastern Connecticut center. What we specialize in is regional thinking and aligning. So we work in close partnership with our statewide partners and in close partnership with local partners on the ground. But we focus regionally. Let's see if I can advance this. These are some of our partners, and sort of the trick that we've found to being successful in this work is that we bring together 4 different areas of technical expertise. So we work with Regional Plan Association as our research and advocacy partner. We work with various community foundations at the regional level who focus on philanthropy and convening. We bring the expertise in collective impact facilitation, and then our partners, the Partnership for Strong Community, who I'm sure you all know, bring the sort of statewide policy and advocacy expertise to the table. So what I'm hoping to talk to you today about, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on a study that we did. We were commissioned by the Department of Housing in 2020 to do a full landscape analysis of Connecticut's affordable and accessible housing and make policy recommendations to them. Actually, what they specifically said was, please make us a roadmap, show us where you think we're going, and tell us how to get there. And so our key research partner in this work was Urban Institute. We spent the better part of a year with their team, our team, Data Haven, and some of the data partners you see on the bottom of the slide, and compiled a report, which of course I will send you, that is more data than anybody ever wanted on housing, but really was helpful in directing strategic policy recommendations in a way that the state hadn't been able to do before. So I'm going to do a bit of an overview of this project for you because I think it's critical context as we talk about those recommendations. I'm going to do my best not to bore you, but I'm assuming all of us here are interested in housing, so it's a little wonky, but bear with me. So again, these were our research partners. It allowed us to leverage the national expertise, regional expertise, and local expertise across assisted and accessible housing. For today, I'm going to focus on assisted housing. The accessible piece for those with disabilities is fascinating, but it's a whole nother rabbit hole, which I'm happy to go down with you offline, but pulled it out of this presentation for today. And as usual, this is, American Community Survey data, National Housing Preservation Database, HUD data, state administrative data, and we also used CoStar data. These are the questions that the state asked us to dig in on, which are pretty self-evident. Again, the third bullet, I'm not going to go into detail on today, but we really took a deep dive look at current population, what the national demographers expect the Connecticut population to be out through 2030 and 2040, and then compiled the first inventory of affordable units that the state has ever pulled, and really then dug in on supply and demand and did a gap analysis on units that we are short. So these are just some of the highlights that the data revealed. And I don't think any of it is too surprising. But as we look at, and tell me I can stop, but as we look at these graphs, this is really, I think, one of the key things that should influence how you think about what kind of housing we need in the future. And the takeaway here is that Connecticut is getting much more racially and ethnically diverse. It happens to also be getting much older, which I wasn't going to put that slide up, but the combination of those two things is important as we think about demand for housing unit types and how that's going to change with the population change. So, for example, an increase in vacant single-family homes. This is pre-pandemic, but in rural areas, we can track, and it's owing to outmigration and the aging population. And those single-family homes are not going to meet the demand of a new, less wealthy and ethnically diverse population for a number of reasons. So, underscores the need for much more multifamily unit development. This is the part of this study that most fascinated me, which is really, we did a gap analysis. So we looked, and all of this, by the way, even if I'm showing you statewide data, we broke this all down by county, and then we further broke it down by town. So you can access that offline, but I'm just trying to give you an overview. So although the total number of very low income households in Connecticut is going to decline through 2040, what we found is that that decrease is not going to be enough to close the current gap in units, which we show here. And what we did was looked at the full supply and population demand. So we broke the population into cost bands, and the gap in the supply is all at the very low end. And when we say low here, we're talking 0 to 30% area median income, up a little bit 0 to 50%. You'll notice the biggest gaps on this are, I'm sorry, if you can't read this, let me know, but households by desired housing cost band are in blue, and then the housing units by cost to occupant are in yellow. The largest gaps, or the gaps, are at the low and high end of the spectrum. And what's fascinating about this is that there's no county in Connecticut that has enough affordable housing units to meet the needs of its very low income housing, of its very low income residents. And you know, we debate this back and forth, but national best practice explains these gaps as it looks like there's a surplus in the low, mid to low, and mid to high. But what happens, in fact, is that we have folks who say are in high income bracket occupying units in the mid to high, and that carries all the way down through. And so we choose to focus on this 86,000 unit gap. And we think it speaks volumes about the hole we have to dig ourselves out of in Connecticut, given the number of units we typically produce in a year, which is, well under 1,000 right now. So takeaway here is we can't build our way out of this. We have to address this in a number of different ways with a number of different strategies. There's no silver bullet. And just keep that in mind as we go through the policy recommendations. Do I need to stop? Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Okay.
I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Great.
So I think you can just go ahead.
Yeah. This is just an interesting part of what we learned. The vast majority of programmatic assistance in Connecticut is channeled within Hartford County, which has twice as many instances of subsidies as the next highest county, which is Fairfield, and 4 times as many as the 3rd highest county, which is New Haven. Also learned that Connecticut's largest concentration of state-funded assisted housing units come from moderate rental housing program, and then followed by restrictive covenant and tax credit assistance programs. As of June 2019, housing choice vouchers represented the largest single source of assisted units in the state. There's about almost 44,000 of them. Section 8 project-based rental assistance and vouchers is the 2nd largest source at just under 30,000. And then public housing falls after that at around 14,000. And just a note on this table that since the unit counts don't attempt to match units within the same developments as we did this, those counts are for individual subsidy programs only, and we can't add them across programs because of the layering of subsidies. So it's a very challenging task to inventory all of this, and it's not as simple and straightforward as one would wish, which is why it doesn't get done very, very often. So this is the sort of fun and important part of this, which is what we analyzed all of this data, worked with all of our partners and some really incredibly talented people at the national level, and came up with a strategy for the state that we're recommending to rethink their policy approach to affordable housing. And it involves these 3 tenets. So currently the production of assisted and accessible housing units is obviously complex, but it's very transactional, and it's largely driven by developer initiative. So I know you all know this, but developers identify projects, apply for subsidies, and work financially to meet the state subsidy program thresholds for affordability. But state dollars are leveraged with private investment to produce and preserve affordable and accessible units this way. And then the state measures its housing strategy success by looking at subsidy transactions. And while this is sort of the traditional development process, and it does produce units, it's highly reactive. And so it's deploying state resources based on opportunities identified and cited by developers, and not necessarily according to community needs or based on a coordinated strategy to improve housing access. So the current process adds units to the state's affordable and accessible inventories, but it doesn't ensure the right volume of units at the right cost bands in the right locations. And the data that we pulled and analyzed really provides a unique opportunity for the state to improve the transactional development process and make it much more proactive. And we'll get into how we recommended they do that. We also obviously are proponents of regional planning. So by committing to data-driven proactive investment and policy, we can target populations in each county where the need for housing at designated cost bands and accessibility levels is greatest, and then prioritize the state's housing investments accordingly. So this study offers county-specific population and demographic trends and analyzes those trends against the backdrop of each county's current affordable and accessible housing inventory. And we feel that this data and analysis can and should be used to recalibrate Connecticut's affordable and accessible housing strategy by prioritizing state funding of assisted units based on identified housing needs of its most cost-burdened populations first. This is an example of the kind of analysis that we worked through, which ranks the number of cost-burdened renters by town. So number one town for cross-burden renters is here in New Haven County. And you can see how these are spread across the state. The dark blue represent the 10 most cost-burdened towns for renters. So just in that, an example of the way we're encouraging the state to take a look at deployment of its resources. This is nothing you all don't know, right? We need to produce units, we need to preserve units, we need to protect them, and then we all need to do a better job of documenting and monitoring, particularly the state. And we can go into how we do this. So under production, these are our 3 priorities. We, again, are encouraging the creation of regional guidelines for assisted housing production targets. So given the size of the gap between the supply of housing and the number of households needing housing in the lowest cost bands, Connecticut faces just a really urgent need to see more housing produced to both prevent private market prices from rising further and to create a larger stock of low-cost units for cost-burdened households. COVID has obviously exacerbated the need to do this and made it even more challenging. But still a priority. We're recommending an adjustment to the qualified allocation plan that CHAFA uses to incentivize LIHTC siting based on cost burdens and to try to avoid concentration of all of our LIHTC units in poor urban centers. And then we also, and Pete may get into this a little bit when he takes over, are looking at a more transit-oriented approach to assisted housing production. And I won't go into that in detail, but there are a number of reasons for that we feel are important. Creating new affordable housing is obviously much more expensive than strategically preserving existing naturally occurring and income restricted units. In Fairfield County, we've reached roughly the $500,000 per assisted unit mark. I mentioned earlier, I'm in Santa Barbara County today, and it's $750,000 per unit, but that's just an unsustainable number, no matter where you are. And since the vast majority of these units that are deed restricted are going to face pressure to convert to higher market rents when their contracts expire over the next 10 to 15 years, we have to really proactively act to strategically preserve them. And these are just some of the recommendations that we're making. Preservation networks exist in other places throughout the country. And we really need to implement them here in Connecticut, where we can share information and coordinate the identification and preservation of government assisted properties at risk of being lost. This one's particularly important right now, again, as COVID has just completely changed the housing market. Private, mom and pop landlords, small multifamily properties, folks are not, they can make a lot of money flipping those to the private market now. It's going to become increasingly difficult to extend affordability and maintain those properties as we go forward. Clearly, protection of affordable housing is also critical. My usual soapbox and rant on this one is that while the state legislature provides for and asks for fair housing offices to be up and running across the state, I can tell you in Fairfield County, the city of Norwalk is the only city in the county that has an operating fair housing office. Again, COVID has exacerbated the impact, the negative impact of that. And that's something we should all be working on fixing. Monitoring and documenting is interesting. As we got into this, we realized why no one had ever pulled a full inventory of assisted units for the state of Connecticut. And it's because nobody keeps the lists. And so that was at least a 6-month project with probably 20 people working across the state and with HUD and with CoStar to pull in naturally occurring affordable units, but just to try to identify what the inventory is. And so we made a series of recommendations to the state on how they could better organize inventory and monitor their data, and all of this really to make space for transparency and accountability. We struggle to hold our public officials at every level of government accountable for meeting housing needs. And part of that is because we don't have a baseline, or we didn't have a baseline on what we had, what we needed to build, and how we do progressing through that. So, and I promise I'm almost done. To tackle that, we, in addition to our published report, we also created a data visualization website called Afford CT, and I'll share the link with you all. But it basically acts as a companion online housing data tool, and the data visualization component provides policymakers, housing practitioners, stakeholders across Connecticut the ability to have a shared understanding of the state's inventory of assisted and accessible units, and then to support all of the recommendations we made, including, programmatic deployment of state resources, a more proactive approach to development, and just in general, more transparency and accountability. This is just a screenshot of the detail that we can get. You can zoom in and out when you get on this site. You can look at it town by town, but every single deed restricted unit in the state of Connecticut is on this map. And it's been helpful as we've been working with towns throughout the state, really, but we focus on Western Connecticut. As they're putting their housing plans together right now, this data has been really important for them to get their arms around their housing needs, and to just sort of take a look at where they're building all of their housing and can they disperse it differently. So just kind of a little tool we hope is helping folks. And we continue to work on this with the state. In fact, this year we will be adding pipeline to this, so you'll be able to visualize what's coming down the pike also. So I'm gonna stop there. That was a lot to take in. So I'll stop and see.
Yeah, why don't we maybe, yeah, it was, I mean, I've absorbed so much, I've turned off my camera. But there we go. It was terrific. Yeah, I got to get the report and unpack a lot of what you said.
Yeah, it's not
In more detail, but I think it was really good to get the overview. I haven't seen any questions coming in yet, but does anybody want to raise your hand and ask a question now and before we break and move over to Pete's presentation and discussion? Or do you want to jot them down and then we'll talk about them in the general conversation later?
I mean, I just want to say this is incredible. So this is Alicia Dolce speaking. I also was trying to absorb a lot of what you were saying. And, you know, as much as I think I know about affordable housing, this presentation reminded me of how much I don't know. And even a lot of the terms, I think that there's vernacular around affordable housing. And there were a couple of slides where I was like, oh, I have to ask about this later. And maybe I'm the only one that has these questions, and I get that. But honestly, this is revelatory. And thanks so much for putting this together and being here today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, agreed.
Very kind.
My
Thank you.
comment to everyone was wow, because, you know, just pulling together the ability to see where all the housing is finally is. I've been doing this stuff for 30 years and it's a long time, but it's worth waiting.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I have one question. Francis Goya is from Penrose Developers. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about adjusting the QAP to incentivize light tech based on cost burdens and avoiding, concentration of affordable housing, and then how that also touches in with the TOD approach, because from our experience, most TOD is in cities, and cities tend to already have higher concentrations of affordable housing, but they also just have higher concentrations of housing. So, one thing that we've been struggling with in our projects is having a great project that's in an urban center, but having it receive little points because it's on a quote unquote low opportunity area. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. And Pete, jump in here because some of this is really in your thing, but Francis, we, it depends on where you are in the state. In Fairfield County, I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think we have 2/3 of the rail stops in Connecticut are in Fairfield County, and many of them are in small towns. So while they do also exist in suburbs, and so the opportunity to increase TOD in suburbs in Fairfield County is quite it's amazing how many towns have actual stops, multiple stops. The town of Fairfield has 3 train stations. The city of Bridgeport has 1. Right? There's a lot of opportunity there that we're really focused on. Desegregate is particularly focused on, and we try to support everything that they're doing around TOD. But that's partly why that's in there, because there are so many suburbs that have, and I don't know if you've spent any time in any of them, but they have these beautiful train stations and they're literally surrounded by acres of parking. And it's, for a number of reasons, state-owned land, municipal-owned land, they're ripe for some sort of low-density development, and that's why we're focused on those. And I'm sorry, what your first question was about the QAP?
Yes, just how that feeds into the QAP of incentivizing light tech based on cost burden.
Yeah, our point there is we're really trying to flip the script and stop the state from, this isn't going to come out right because it's not really the word allowing, but it's, the process is developer driven right now. And the point is, if we're going to sort of make the highest and best use of limited state resources for housing development, the state should be much more thoughtful about where that development is, because they can be. And the QAP, if we can get them to change that so that LIHTC developments must take into account prioritization of population based on need, that would be a huge step forward for us, even in that, LIHTC continues to produce units across the country. This is true, not just Connecticut, but it's not producing them at the right cost band. So if we have this limited LIHTC resource, we have, we got a building where there's 80% units being put in Fairfield County, you still have to make almost $100,000 a year to cover that. And we don't have a gap in that cost band of units. Our unit gap in the state is at the 0 to 30, maybe 50%. And so we've got to reorganize prioritization based on need to cover that.
Okay, thanks, Christy. Thomas Manning, you have a question? You can unmute yourself, or I can unmute. There you go.
Yes. Why is transit-oriented development focusing on train stations and does not include commuter parking lots for buses? I'm the chairman of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Bolton, and we have a very large commuter lot, just like you've described. And there's some great places around there to build housing, but we're not going to be part of the programs, and our deficiency in affordable housing units is probably greater than a lot of other communities.
Yeah, Pete, jump in here.
Yeah, I can jump in. Thanks, Christy. Yeah, to your point, Thomas, I guess I have two answers to that point. One is we're purposely starting around existing transit, fixed transit stations. So the CT Rail, CT Fast Track. That's partially because there's a great need in those 40 communities, cities and towns with 62 stations. Second of all, just more from a political standpoint, the buy-in of saying the state has invested and all of us have invested millions of dollars of taxpayer funding into this transportation network. The idea that a considerable amount of these towns that have stations are not doing subsequently smart land use policy around them is fairly, or in theory, should be relatively low-hanging fruit politically. So I already put in the chat our page dedicated to TOCs specifically. This goes through the report that we put together based on our zoning atlas, which I'll talk about in a second, going through those 40 towns and cities. The majority of them do not allow multifamily housing as of right, have minimum lot size requirements, any number of issues that really restrict the ability to build multifamily housing around those stations. So we thought that's primarily the first place that we need to start from a need and opportunity standpoint. To the second point, with in Bolton specifically with the commuter lot, generally, I think the next step for our advocacy and research is incorporating state-owned, municipal-owned land around stations or commuter lots that have opportunity to build housing. It just, obviously, to everybody on this call, it's not anything new, but it doesn't make sense to build, upgrade our transit system and then build parking lots so somebody drives from the lot or their home to the lot. That's just, they're going to keep driving. So if we really want to get the most out of that infrastructure, we need to build housing, mixed-use development around those stations and those commuter lots. So my optimistic viewpoint would be we're close to getting the TOC in those 40 towns and cities, probably likely the next session. The next expansion of TOC would be around our CT transit bus stations and Main Street locations, which is a proposal we kind of put together 2 years roughly, in those sort of areas in the commuter belt and the commuter shed of our major cities, having more resources put into housing around that whether it's publicly owned by the state or local area. So it's, and I'll get into it, my kind of little spiel, but primarily it's a political issue that we're trying to navigate, which, makes some decisions harder from an organizing standpoint to get to all at once. But that's I think the best short answer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Alicia has her hand up on maybe one more question, and then we'll move on to Pete's presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. Because I wanted to revisit something that Francis actually mentioned, because it made me think of something else. And it sounds like we're going to be going down into, into more TOD issues. But Christy, can you just speak, when you said, we can't build our way out of this, it really made me wonder about the distinction between new construction versus existing housing stock. So can you just speak to that in general in terms of what you see, and how you see those two factors?
Yeah, and it's a real issue, right? Because when you talk about affordable housing, everybody wants to know how many units you're building. But here's how I frame this, and I'm going to focus on Fairfield County because I have those numbers at the top of my head. But in the last 10 years, Fairfield County hasn't even added 5,000 units, affordable units, to its housing stock. And it is currently 25,000 and some change units short. Right. So at that pace, that's not workable. And because of the cost to build those units, right, for obvious reasons, we're not going to build our way out of that. And so I think that we as a sector should be really focusing on preservation. Connecticut's housing stock is very old. It is falling apart. And those units that are deed restricted right now are expiring at really, and that the expiry of those units is going to increase exponentially over the next 5 to 7 years because the LIHTC program started 30 to 40 years ago. So, and dollar for dollar, preservation goes farther than production. It's not as exciting, but I think there's more bang for your buck, dollar for dollar, if you're just looking at return on investment. And I think that is an underappreciated framing for this conversation. One of the things that we are working on with LISC actually is building a programmatic capital pool. So instead of looking at capital pools available for specific projects, we're looking at constructing a capital pool region by region that could be focused on preservation writ large, or more programmatic than site specific, I guess is the point, as one of the ways we could do that. I also, on my sort of laundry list of things we should really do quickly, we should stand up preservation networks. Again, just in general, politicians are less excited about preservation. It's not that it's not the same as putting up a brand new building and having a ribbon cutting, but return on investment wise, it should be, I think, where the state is focusing its limited resources.
Well, maybe we could talk about the optics of each preserved building as a way to convince the political system that, hey, it's the same thing and it's a lot more cost effective. So that's a messaging thing that we can talk about in the P2P group. But let's turn it over to Pete for a second, and then we can come back to questions after you're done, Pete. So you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you, Dean. I'm just going to throw up, I already threw up a link to our TOC page, but I'm just going to put up our full page for folks to reference. But again, my name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut. We are a program of the Regional Plan Association, which works very closely with Christy. And we are a pro-homes coalition of over 80 groups across the state of Connecticut, from neighborhood groups to anti-racism groups to affordable housing provider groups. And our mission is to make a more equitable and sustainable Connecticut, focusing on land use reform. We take what we call an all of the above approach to land use reform. We do a lot of local advocacy, trying to get people activated in all 169 towns that have planning and zoning commissions. And we also take a state level approach to get more coordination at the regional and state levels, as Christy had pointed out. I'll also say, before we get into some of our research, we think land use reform is one part of this housing crisis altogether. And whether it's construction, preservation, subsidy, public sector, private sector, we need more homes in our state. That's why we call ourselves pro homes. So even though we focus laserly on land use reform, because there is such a gap in Connecticut on this advocacy point, we think of ourselves as broadly part of this larger housing conversation very much, very closely. So our three sort of core holy trinity areas of focus are racial equity, economic prosperity, and environmental sustainability. You can't talk about land use in one of these aspects without impacting the others. So our research advocacy efforts are based on connecting dots to people in decision-making capacity or just homeowners or home renters to show that the impact of these policy decisions over the course of 50, 60 years has made Connecticut one of the most racially and economically segregated states in the country, which also makes it hard for us to solve the housing crisis currently. And even more ominously, it makes it very difficult for us to face the climate crisis that's already here. So we think doing all of those things starts with land use reform. And one of the first places that we thought as an organization we'd provide some value was actually trying to put together data about land use at the state level. And what I'll share my screen for and go over very quickly is kind of the first neat resource we put together, which was this statewide zoning atlas. It's the first of its kind in the country. We're actually partnering with other groups in other states to design similar maps in other places. So I'm gonna just share the screen here. I hope I do it correctly. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a quick tech check. Can folks see my screen with this purple map of Connecticut?
Yes,
And can they
thank
hear
you.
me? Okay, great. I've been teaching online at CUNY for 2 years during the pandemic. I still get this stuff wrong. Okay, so what you are looking at very quickly is this zoning atlas that I talked about. And this put together all the different zoning districts in the state of Connecticut over a number of different attributes to map out through some GIS work with Data Haven and New Haven to put together a map of why we think land use reform is such a critical issue within the housing crisis. And just for some perspective, I'm going to throw three different kind of map configurations up to have some conversation here. This first one is the de facto Connecticut land use planning that we all know, which is as of right, family housing, single family housing on roughly 1 acre of land. So the map here in purple right now, and I'll manipulate it a little bit here. This is where one family housing is allowed as of right in Connecticut. Over 80% of Connecticut's residential land falls into this category. Almost, let me pull up here. About 80% of it requires just about 1 acre or more of land. In fact, 50% of the land requires nearly 2 acres. Some of that's for septic tank technology in the middle of the century and other reasons. But primarily, the issue that we face in Connecticut, why we cannot build more housing, and to some degree why we can't preserve more housing, is the price pressure around the fact that our land is completely misallocated around single family housing. Christy had that point about the housing gaps of not just the economic bands, but also the racial and ethnic bands in Connecticut. We were just over 50 years of building single family housing on large lots and banning multifamily housing has created a massive gap between the kind of housing, the kind of homes that we need in Connecticut and the homes that we have on offer or that we can build right now. One of the other things I'll show quickly here is the inverse of this. So I'll just go to 4+ family housing allowed as of right. And that purple map basically vanishes. That's because only 2% of residential land in Connecticut allows multifamily housing of 4 or more units as of right. And you can see, as you'd expect, pockets around some of our cities and a couple other areas. But that is just not part of the reality of land use policy and planning in our state, which we, of course, understand on this call leads into a lot of the problems that we face here. So a lot of our advocacy work, particularly at the local level, is trying to get planning and zoning commissioners aware of these issues, recognizing that all 169 towns, particularly in the suburbs and rural parts of the state, have to think beyond the narrow interests of certain homeowners that can show up to planning and zoning meetings and think more broadly about the next generation of residents, including their kids, grandkids, other aspirational residents, folks wanting to move to Connecticut, businesses wanting to attract workers. So we do a lot of our efforts at this local level to get people to show up, advocate for multifamily housing, smaller lot sizes, the kinds of policies that we know produce at least some affordable housing outside of more subsidies. And that's primary focus. The other focus that we have that we alluded to a little bit is at the state level. We really think, particularly because Connecticut is a smaller state, it has a legacy public transit infrastructure, its location, obviously, to New York City, to a lesser degree, Boston, gives it a lot of natural advantages, particularly in this kind of post-pandemic work from home world, where if we leverage this existing infrastructure, we make the most of it, Connecticut can get past a lot of the economic stagnation and population stagnation that we have seen. And one of the primary places to start, as we've already talked about, is transit-oriented communities. So on our map here, we have mapped the 62 transit stations in Connecticut. Sorry, let me pull this over. There's probably a little bit of a lag, so just bear with me. We've tracked these 62 transit stations, which are CT rail stations, Hartford Line, Waterbury Branch, Danbury Branch, East Shore Line, plus CT Fast Track Rapid Bus from New Britain to Hartford, with the idea of, again, putting together just helpful data of understanding where these assets exist, and more importantly, more frustratingly, where there's a lack of smart land use planning around this. I'm going to try to zoom in here to a couple of particularly bad actors, which probably doesn't shock anybody, is in Fairfield County. But here we can show just between Bridgeport and Fairfield. Christy mentioned the 3 transit station, the rail stations in Fairfield. So what this circle around these stations indicates is a half-mile radius, or about a 10-minute walk, which just empirically is a very functional place for folks to walk to commute to transit stations. And again, you can see in this purple where there is, as of right, multifamily housing allowed. There are very few pockets in our suburban rail stations. Fairfield, in some cases, particularly Fairfield Metro, has actually done some work. That's partly why you see some of that graph, including this. But the big problem, particularly on the Metro North line, to some degree Hartford Line, particularly East Shore Line, some of the branches, is these stations do not exist around housing. There might be a commuter lot, they might be light commercial or sort of post-industrial land that is not being leveraged for housing construction. And again, unfortunately, there are a lot of 22 out of the 40 transit towns and stations do not allow multifamily housing as of right. Some of them are particularly bad actors. This is Westport, that does not allow anything. So there's a real disconnect between the existence, frankly, for 200 years of these transit infrastructure, but not leveraging it for housing construction. So Connecticut, this past year at the legislature, we proposed a bill for transit-oriented communities based very closely on what passed at state law in Massachusetts last year, which effectively in this half-mile radius would allow multifamily housing as of right up to 15 homes per acre on average, which could be anywhere from duplexes to townhouses to apartment buildings, whatever. And the idea would be the town would have a lot of control over that process, even passing the state law. It would just shift the public approval process away from individual projects, which tends to kill a lot of these projects, as a lot of us know, onto more of the broader, here's the baseline our town has to comply with at the state law. So within this half-mile radius, where can we focus development to get to that 15 homes per acre? Rough estimates, you'd say minus existing housing structures or commercial structures, roads, et cetera, and environmentally sensitive lands. We pegged it about 500 acres within that radius, conservatively, or about 25% of that landscape. And if you did that at 15 homes per acre, you're talking about the construction, or at least the opportunity to construct about 115,000 homes across the state. And again, at the town municipal level, towns would have at the forefront the opportunity to say, okay, we've got this half acre, or we've got this radius half mile. Let's put it in 25% of that radius right by the main street with some commercial space and some old industrial space. And we'll put that at 45 homes per acre, and that will comply with the state law. So that was our intention. Unfortunately, we did not make it through the Planning and Development Committee. It's a short session in an election year, so more than the policy itself, just the politics kind of worked against us, and the clock worked against us. But we have a wide swath of folks who bought into this proposal. We had over 117 substantive written testimony, and I think we're looking very good for next year to bring that in place. We're going to have conversations about affordability, some discrepancies between larger suburban areas, smaller suburban areas, but we'll get this passed. So I want to stress that TOC development is inevitable in Connecticut. It's too popular and too smart not to get through. The politics will be in better shape for us next session. But again, this is just one part of the conversation, a very necessary part of it. But building homes, preserving homes, involving the public sector, that's all part of the Pro Homes agenda. So this is just one small part of it. But I want to stop there and take some questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I'm looking down the list. Nobody's got their hands raised, but if you want to jump in, please do. I know, Pete, you have like a hard stop right around 12:30-ish. So now's your chance, people. David, you can unmute and ask your question, David Berto.
Okay, yes, thank you. This is, as always, a very good discussion, very good inputs, good speakers. The maps, I think, are quite helpful too, because they do show the transit-oriented locations in a half-mile radius. The talk is all about where people live, but it's got to be about where people work as well, because the only way transit works is if they live at one spot and they work at another spot. And we help groups all over Connecticut, all the little towns. And the little towns are struggling to get workers because they can't have people living nearby. They have to have cars. Everybody has to have cars. We know that. But there still has to be affordable housing in small towns in order to let the employment grow or the economy grow. The challenges there are the focus that we're seeing. The other challenges are affordable housing just costs more for small projects in small towns. And LIHTC doesn't work if you have a small project. So it's good to talk about LIHTC, it's good to talk about TOD, but we have to really look at the rest of the state as well. That's my input.
Yeah, thank you, David. I mean, that's partly why we have all of the above is our sort of catchphrase to approach this issue. It's not about figuring one solution from a land use perspective for all 169 towns. That wouldn't be smart. What issues face New Haven are very different from Goshen. And we think there's a space for housing in all of those types of communities. But I think primarily, our focus is, broadly speaking, trying to build more homes, more kinds of homes across the state at a state level to relieve some of those pressures and those gaps. The nature of work is very much shifting post-COVID, and the opportunity for people to work in a hybrid setting create some opportunities in certain places I don't think were necessarily true in Connecticut a couple of years ago. That's partly why we have some housing pressure. But I want to say too, I don't think, and this came up in the hearing about the bill, where there was I think probably a bad faith argument to say that, well, people need to go drive cars to go to stores, and that's very true. The idea here is not eliminating every car trip for people. It's eliminating a number of them, either at the individual household level or sort of the community level. And I think one of the major opportunities, particularly around TODs, that we're talking with state DOT is the idea that, you know, this 40 million annual ridership on Metro North down to New York City is not coming back. And at the funding resource right now, the argument for housing around these stations for those kinds of commuters is under threat. But I think the opportunity is to say there are lots of commuters that commute from or would like to commute from a Waterbury to Bridgeport, or from a Weston to a New Haven, or from a Berlin to a Hartford. And our transit system isn't designed for that. So as we're trying to change the land use policy to encourage more of this kind of, you know, traditional village living where people can commute a little bit, it's also trying to get policymakers at the different agencies to recognize that this is a big shift, and that, you know, the idea of just getting a commute down to New York City is a really backwards way to think about the opportunity that we have on this infrastructure. So, you know, that's, I think, a piece of this that's important to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Alicia, you've got your hand up.
I do, and it's a thank you, Pete. Your presentation was just as compelling as Christie's. So as the executive director of the Connecticut Green Building Council, I'm always, you know, we're also seek to build coalitions, and certainly desegregate. We're actually part of the coalition for Desegregate Connecticut, and really, you know, proud to be a member of that coalition. You said a few times that a lot of your advocacy work is at the local level, where you're, you know, with P&Z commissions, and I'm really delighted to see that Tom is here. So there's 169 towns in Connecticut. So how do you get the word out to 169 P&Z commissions, and or how does, if there was someone in, like, say in my town of Guilford, who like wants to be on board and wants to work towards this change, how does that process work, where you can sort of get into this pipeline of, yes, you know, what are the resources at the local level, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate it. I'll put this link. This is a link to kind of the local advocacy group work that we do. I mean, it's hard. I'm not gonna lie. It's, you know, we're a small organization, a lot of young people and volunteers, and our outreach right now is trying to educate folks, do as many events as possible to get people that are interested in these issues activated in their towns. The link I put in the website has some resources that we've put together to help people, you know, at the town level, all of this great data from Christy's organization, from partnership for other groups, plus Desegregate CT, trying to coordinate it, contextualize it for locals. It's not wonky. You don't need a law degree or a planning degree to get involved in these things. And then the mechanics of actually showing up and talking at a public meeting, and furthermore, trying to run or get appointed to commissions is a big part of what we're trying to do. Fundamentally, Desegregate CT, this is a political project. I'm like a planner background, academic background, and that's something I've had to learn as well, but it's not really about the policy, it's more about the politics. So we try to organize with that in mind, of what motivates people to want to see a better community that they live in, a more inclusive and sustainable community. How do you actually go about changing that at the local level? How do you plug into this bigger movement? And I think we've had some success of getting, you know, people elected or appointed that are pro-homes commissioners, showing up, speaking at local meetings. We're advocating for maintaining Zoom meetings and even asynchronous meetings, so folks that work at night or have childcare, et cetera, can participate in these kinds of meetings. So it's an ongoing process, but that to me is the best reservoir of change at the state level. It's really hard to get stuff done at the state level, as Christy and I know everybody on this call probably knows. It's still really important to do so, but our success at the state level actually starts at getting a lot of these folks activated locally. So we're going to do a lot more of that. I just started 2 months ago, and we've got a big project over the summer to really ramp up some of this local organizing. But there are a lot of people that are not in this conversation at the community level that can't get to these kinds of meetings. Activating them, getting them involved, getting them elected is a big part of changing the narrative and shifting this premise that we're all trying to work on here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
thank you.
I know.
Yeah, as I say, that resonates a lot with what my experience is, but I didn't know you'd only been there 2 months, so we'll talk later.
Yeah, I'd like to say also that for both Pete and Christy, the stuff that's going on in Hartford and the kind of politics you're talking about, if there's ways that people in our network can be alerted to them, whether at the local level or particularly state issues. I mean, we got heavily involved in the QAP 15 months ago and sort of worked through that process. But there's a core group that worked on that, but there's a larger group that are members that might be interested in this, particularly if it's TOD, developers are part of our world. And so, and if it's affordable, we'll play both sides on this, but we do have a good network that can get the word out. So feel free to use us. Also, just want to mention to everybody that there's a bunch of information and links that have been put in the chat. So if people want to, by both Christy and Pete, so if people want to follow up. And finally, one question, then I'll get to Kathy. Somebody asked about this presentation. Will it be available? And Vicki, yes, it will be on the Connecticut Green Bank peer-to-peer site within about 2 days. Is that right, Vicki?
Yeah, I hope to have it up by early next week.
Okay, Kathy. You're muted.
I'm
still.
trying to, yeah, I'm working on it. So yeah, I want to join everybody who said so and thanking both Christy and Pete. These are fabulous presentations. And, you know, it's so important for those of us, most of the members of this group are the people who are on the ground trying to make housing happen as developers, architects, others. And land accessibility is such an issue, and all of the other approvals in suburban areas. Many of the things people have talked about are important, but in the end, you know, 9% credits are, I don't know, a little over 200 units a year in the state, and we have 80,000 unit gap. And I wonder, and I'm going to ask this now, but some of us stay a little after the presentation for a more informal conversation. And Pete, I know you have to leave, but maybe Christy can join us. How do we get more resources? Because fighting over the existing resources isn't the solution.
Right. I think
But we
that's
like ending these meetings with a small question. And an unchallenging one. So we thank Kathy for that. But yeah, we can stay on as long as people want to. I'll just make a quick announcement that we're having another peer-to-peer May 20th focusing on energy storage. So more will come on that. But yeah, who wants to take that one on? Any ideas?
I hate to duck out right when that question comes up.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
Sure you do, Pete.
I do have some thoughts on that.
All right, very good one.
And I think I appreciate your sense of humor very much, Dean. If we knew the answer to this question, right, none of us would be here. But I will say one of the ways that the Housing Collective looks to do this is where we spent the first, 10 years of our organizational existence really solving that issue for the homeless emergency response system in Western Connecticut. And what we landed on was we need to align and access federal funds as much as possible. We have to position the state as well as we can to access any federal dollars that are out there so that all of this doesn't fall on the backs of Connecticut taxpayers because the problem is so big. We are absolutely replicating that strategy at the Centers for Housing Opportunity. And one of the ways we do that is region by region. You can work with your COG, you can, there are different ways to look regionally, but looking at federal resources and how to bring them to the region, not just to an individual project or to an individual organization. And we have had moderate success with homelessness. We increased federal funding to Fairfield County by almost 60%. We added another $45 million that individual organizations in Connecticut were not positioned to apply for or administer, but a regional organization, a backbone pass-through organization can do. So there is some of that that needs to be done around housing as well. Not that that's a silver bullet, because there isn't one, but it's part of the solution.
Then a question further to that. So on the preservation side of this and the preservation network idea, if an equal amount of funds came to, for whatever successful process we had for getting them, do you leverage a lot more of housing by preserving housing? Do you leverage a lot more units than you might by new construction if that money was all spent there? Is there a delta between the cost to preserve, even though it doesn't necessarily meet the gap, but it could meet some of the gap, and the cost to build new? Has anybody looked at that? Is that do you split the monies, or do you try to focus in one area?
We haven't done a deep dive on that, but just in general, we know, and I actually think Urban has done a study on that, but not since COVID. But that's the that's the general idea, right? Yes, your return on investment is tenfold when you're preserving. And just a little anecdotal example of that, Kathy and I and Carla have been talking and working on a preservation project in Bridgeport that involves 942 units of affordable home, naturally occurring affordable home ownership in the form of a cooperative, right? Pulling down resources, federal, state, what have you, to that project, you're much more bang for your buck than trying to either build 924 units of affordable home ownership. So it's a good way to look at sort of the exponential impact of preservation as opposed to production.
If you look at, would preservation writ large, or maybe with a small p, cover preservation of a reasonably large single family home and adapting it for duplexes, quads, and stuff like that, because that's where you now start to add units, right? And so
Exactly.
Yeah.
Critical. Yeah.
All right.
Carla, you've got your hand up.
Carla has a question. Yeah.
Just actually, it's an extension of that. A lot of the lending that we do is for 2, 3, 4 family housing in the urban environments that's blighted. So does that figure into your thought about preservation? I mean, it's a few at a time, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what we know is that 65% of rental housing stock in the state of Connecticut, and that may have inched up a little bit, are small multifamily mom and pop, less than 4 units. And it's actually one of the reasons it's so hard to track an inventory is you can go through CoStar or Black Knight to get data on 4+ unit buildings, but there is no aggregation of data or even capture or data repository for 0 to 4%, or sorry, 0 to 4 unit multifamilies. So it's really difficult to get a handle on.
And who on a preservation program like that, who makes money on that? I mean, who in the world would we want to commit to doing more of that?
If it's mom and pop sort of owning a 4 unit, right, preserving that unit theoretically is increasing the value of their asset. And there is some great data to show how impactful that can be and how many kids have gone to college because their parents own a 2-unit house and they took a mortgage out on it to pay for college. So there is significant community wealth preservation and building there.
And we're looking at ways to try to encourage that. And, there are a lot of investors that have come into the state, especially in towns like New Haven and Bridgeport. And we're looking at ways to encourage local folks who live in the neighborhoods to get into that business, and so that they're managing locally. And one of the great things that would leverage this, because many of the borrowers we lend to, there's no subsidy. So obviously it's not going to be a restricted unit, but if there were more wraps, if there was a more, solid stream of guaranteed revenues, you could do a lot more units that way. Just and it would be a lot less per unit than trying to build subsidized units.
Yeah, it's not a group we've ever had in the P2P. Sort of part of our conversations is not that the homeowner, but it's a fascinating sort of area to get into. I'm not sure what we can do about it, but that's certainly worth thinking about. Other questions or comments from the field? Okay.
So I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Christy.
I would love to join your group if you
All right, we're
are
full.
willing to invite me. So I'm sure Vicky can talk to me about that, but
Absolutely, yeah.
that would be great.
No, the dues are really low. In fact,
Excellent.
they're vanishingly low. It's an hour and a half a month, but still, absolutely, yeah. Please join. Get Peak to join too. Yeah, everybody's welcome. So, so good. Well, that's a high note to end on. Hey, we recruited 2 new people, guys. Just delightful way to end the week. Okay, I don't really have anything more other than to wish a great weekend on the people who are actually on this coast, and enjoy it. And so, like I said, May 20th is the next one. We'll get a little bit more into energy storage right now, maybe energy storage plus something else, and we'll get the word out to you probably within about a week. And all of this should post by early part of next week. And those who are new, Christy, to the group, you can check out some of the other things we've done over the years because they're all there. Well, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, they're 2 or 3 years they're there. So.
And thank you so much for having me. It's not often you find an audience who's interested in the strange, wonky things that occupy my days, but really appreciate your time this morning.
Well, likewise. Thank you very much for.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody else. Have good weekends, and we'll see you in a month.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.